waiting for a few more people to join, and then we'll start at the hour. Good. I'll wait for just a few more people to join, and then we'll start. Good. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event about urban living labs and their possible role in making food system transformations more inclusive. My name is Walter Franje, and I'm a Research and Communications Officer for Table, based at Wageningen University and Research. Table is a collaboration between the University of Oxford and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences and Wageningen University and Research. And in our work, we aim to explore the evidence, values, and assumptions that people bring to debates about the future of food. We're organizing this Ask the Author session today in collaboration with the Food and Cities Network at SLU. And this network is a network for inter and transdisciplinary research at the intersection of sustainable urban development and food and agriculture. The idea for this event really emerged from discussions within the Food and Cities Network about the inclusiveness of urban agriculture initiatives in Europe, which I think tend not to represent the diversity of urban populations, but are often spaces that are shaped by so-called green elites and by their views on sustainability. We realized then that actually this lack of inclusiveness in urban agriculture may be exemplary for much wider lack of inclusiveness in urban food systems transformations in general. And as cities grow larger and their populations become increasingly diverse, the question of inclusiveness in urban food systems transformations becomes increasingly more pressing. And this is what brings us to the article that we're discussing today. And this article takes exactly that issue of inclusiveness as its starting point and reflects on the possible role of urban living labs for more inclusive food systems transformations. And we are joined today by two of the authors that you see on the screen, also Anke Blons and Koen van der Gaast. Very welcome to you both. Koen and Anke are both in the final stages of their PhD research at the ERES University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. And together with the other authors of this paper, they are part of a group of researchers who study food systems issues in Almere from different angles. And this paper basically brings together much of their shared experiences and then reflects on the role that urban living labs could play in food systems transformations. While reading the article myself, I noticed that you stressed in the article that you don't come with new empirical evidence, but that this is really a think piece that is meant as a starting point for further discussion and reflection. And that is exactly what we hope to achieve in this session today. We're joined by a diverse panel of people who have read the article and prepared some questions and their reflections. And besides that, we also welcome everyone else questions and comments. Please add those to the Zoom Q&A rather than the chat. I just keep this very short and give a short recap of the agenda, which is as follows. We'll first start with a brief introduction to the paper and its findings by Anke and Koen, and that will then be followed by a Q&A and space for further discussion and reflection. Everything together will take about 1 hour and 15 minutes. And I want to say that at the end of the session, we'll switch off the recording in order to create space for more informal discussion for people who want to stay a bit longer. And this would also be a space where we can pick up things that we can't cover in more detail during the main session. Good, with that said, I'm going to hand over to Anke and Koen to introduce their paper and share their findings. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Walter, for introducing us, and thank you also for having us. You did steal my introducing line, because what you just said, I want to start with that this is a very nice opportunity we have to bring this paper to the fore, because this is why we've written it. We've written it not to make our empirical mark on history, but to provide a thinking piece, because we ourselves as research group have struggled with this. What is a living lab, and how can you make such a living lab inclusive? But before I get to that, I first want to introduce the larger team which we written this paper, because only two of us are here, Anke and I. And Anke and I are both part of a 3 PhD program together with Jan Ilko Jansma, as supervised by Sigrid Wertheim-Hek, which is our professor or lector of applied science, as we say in the Netherlands. And the other two participants of our research team are Harrison Awu, who is a postdoc and studies food and inclusivity, and Claudia Segreto, which is a research assistant of our department, and she studies. She's a nutritionist, and she studies also food and inclusivity with regards to food consumption. So as a group, we wrote this paper. But before I get to that, I first want to. Oh, my slide is, yeah, it works. Before I get to that, I first want to say a bit about the background of our study, and especially the research site we all study. Because on this picture you see the city, the central square of the city of Almere. And this is a city located in the province of Flevoland in the Netherlands. Flevoland is the youngest province of the Netherlands. In the 50s, in the previous age, we reclaimed it from the sea, as we Dutch people tend to do more often. In this case, to have more land for agriculture. And in later stages, in the 50s, also cities emerged here to deal with the overflow of population from other big cities in the area. And the city of Almere in particular is a city which was designed to be connected to its agricultural hinterland. And in the last 2 decades, it increasingly positioned itself as a city that wants to stimulate sustainable and healthy food. Also, city of Almere is also a city with a lot of ethnic minorities. So inclusivity here is very important. And the municipality of Almere increasingly concerns itself about food and sustainability. And one of the things they did to further this cause is having a special subsidy for research on food and healthy living. And this subsidy was used also to make our research team. And when we started, both Anke and I, we started based on a job description which said, Almere, you will study Almere as a living lab. And when we started, we had some conception of our own what a living lab was. It was something to do with experimenting and finding out new ways of living, new ways of dealing with food and sustainability. But it was never really explicit. And we worked on our own research, and over time, our research team grew. And a postdoc joined, a research assistant joined. At some point, we as a team thought we should come together and discuss this. What is an urban living lab? What does it entail? What is it not? And based on this, we started to sort of discuss one another how we all studied this. We all studied or approached this living lab, and we noticed that we have a different perspective on this. Some of us are really studying a more ethnographical fashion, how people live, how people consume food, and also how they experiment with that within their own routines. And others were studying more this in terms of how can we envision different futures of food. And we noticed that these both are different perspectives that can help each other out. And based on that, we started to write this paper, not as an empirical contribution, but as a thinking piece, like Walter already said, really to help us structure our mind, structure our thinking about how we see urban living, but also to engage others in this conversation and in these different ways in which we look at urban living labs and inclusivity. Anke, will you pick up from here?
Yes, thank you, Koen, for this introduction of the background of the paper. So now it's up to me to briefly elaborate the two types of urban living labs that we came up with in our paper. And after that, Koen will pick it back up with the discussion points that we brought up in our paper. So basically, the paper situates itself within the challenges we can see in cities regarding inclusive citizen engagement with urban food matters. So what we see also, as Walter mentioned before, and we see kind of green elite, people that are highly educated, often white, that engage with matters of food, but this is really a small part of the population. And especially in the city of Almere, where we have a very diverse population, this is something that we want to challenge a bit in our approach. To think about ways to make thinking about urban food more inclusive. And so we came to the concept of an urban living lab, which is a concept that can be traced back to the Chicago School of Sociology, starting in the 60s in the US. And this was characterized by looking for solutions to local problems by looking in the neighborhoods themselves. So really looking at real life situations to look for answers to problems by community engagement. And ever since then, the concept of the urban living lab has been taken up in many different ways by many different people in many different disciplines, and always with a different kind of conceptualization of the role of the citizen. So for some, the citizen is just a data point, basically, where you can get some information about mobility, for instance. And in other cases, the citizen is really involved from start to finish in a socio-technical transformation project. But we identified two main issues that we also experienced in our work to do with urban living labs. And these are related to the urban living labs that we then propose. So the first main issue we see is the limited reach of citizen engagement in many urban food system transformations in terms of population groups, so in terms of the breadth of engagement. And the other one is the limited way in which citizens are involved in their diversity of roles. So maybe not just as consumers, but also as food producers and as sort of agents in their daily life of making new urban food futures. So this is to do with the depth of engagement, as we called it. So that leads me to these two types of living labs that we then came up with. Firstly, the living lab as the daily life. That's the one that is aimed at the sort of breadth of engagement, so trying to involve as many different diverse groups of citizens. This living lab is aimed at uncovering what we call the unreflexive agency of this diverse population. And what we mean is looking beyond explicit ethical consumerism, so to say. So not just at the sort of green elite that is engaged with sustainability, sustainable food, healthy food in their daily life, but more looking at what happens in everyday life without necessarily being called sustainable, healthy, or being like sort of active engagement with food. This also leads to the orientation of being focused on contemporary life, looking at routinely enacted day-to-day activities, so without necessarily much reflection. We base ourselves often in social practice theory, which is a social theory that we tend to use in our team in Almere. And then the type of citizen engagement this leads to, like I said, is the breadth of engagement, so involving different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic groups, different age group, all these things. And it's very important to then think about the question, who's living in the lab? So identifying who are the citizens you're actually working with. And that also then leads to, in terms of methods, a more methodological eclectic approach, which is inspired by the Chicago School of Sociology as well. So not using one particular method, but really using different methods for different groups of populations, and also sequential to get as much information from the different groups in their own ways. So this is the one type of living lab that we identified that some of us engaged in our research. The second type is the living lab as a break with daily life. So this one is quite different in the sense that it really asks people to step out of their daily context, their daily food practices, And it's more aimed at what we call then reflexive agency. Breaking out of the daily life to reflect on what is happening right now and how we can think about alternatives for the food system. So this leads to a future orientation of this living lab, really focused on looking ahead. And it then also the type of citizen engagement we then refer to as more sort of deep engagement. So this means going quite far in imagining the future, making it quite concrete, and really engaging citizens in a very, sort of deep way. And we also provide an example of that in our paper with a particular neighborhood in Almere that was sort of designed in this process of citizen engagement and eventually did get to be built, so to become daily life. And then the kind of methods that we then propose is what we refer to it as futuring methods. It could be different methods as well, such as placemaking or design thinking, but basically any kind of methods that really focuses on making people reflect and taking them out of their daily life. So these are the two types of urban living labs. Over to you, Koen.
Yes, thank you, Anke. So in our paper, we fleshed these two types of living labs out and provided some examples from our empirical work to show how this worked in our case. We did not really want to argue that this is the only way to look upon urban living labs, but that's a perspective that helps us to focus also on the different ways in which urban living labs can be utilized, and also how they together can help to be more inclusive. So in our discussion, we reflected on this attempt on the question: how can these two types of living lab help to understand how to include more people in this process to go towards more sustainable food system, which is of course very important in cities such as Almere, which has a lot of minorities and people from other origins. So it's very important to think about how to include as much perspectives as possible. Well, what we argue in our discussion, a couple of things. First, we differentiate urban living labs from participative processes in democracies in general, which we think this is also because one of the reviewers mentioned this, like, okay, what is different from an urban living lab than just ask people to participate in planning their neighborhoods? We argue that our perspective is not just about talking and giving people the opportunity to talk and to discuss their feelings or their perspectives, but actually doing. So actually, in our first type of living lab, it's really about seeing how people do this unreflexive working of their routines, how they actually do live within the confines of their life in terms of food production. And in the second type of living lab, it's of course about doing something differently. And I think this is actually what separates us from in general participative processes. It's just one point we make in the discussion. Another one is that we argue that based on how we see these two living labs, is that we think that if you want to have an inclusive citizen engagement as much as possible, that you need to have to build in a sort of sequential design. So each of these living labs has its perks and its pitfalls in terms of inclusivity. So the first type of living lab really helps to get a grasp of who is living in the lab, all these different people with all their different complexities of their daily lives, and really understands who to include and how to include them. But of course, you still don't know, based when you use this type of living lab, how things could be done differently, how things could be done more sustainable or more healthy. So you need the other one, the second living lab, to induce the depth. The second type of living lab has the pitfall of when you engage people in terms of depth. If you want to work with them on a specific topic for a couple of weeks or maybe months, just to really flesh something out, like how can we change our daily lives, then of course you cannot. That is a bit of a trade-off with also including a lot of different people from different perspectives. And we argue that if you want to have both, you need to try to build in a sort of sequential design in which you first try to assess who is living in this lab, who are these different perspectives, and then secondly, try to take as much of these perspectives as possible to work towards a different future in this second type. in general, we also listed the complications with that, because of course, both types of living labs have difficulties in terms that they're both often short-term interventions. As we discussed in the literature, also shows that especially the second type of living lab really needs to have multiple interventions and interactions to really stick. And also, there are problems with the space of encounter. The first type of living lab, you can engage people in their own living environment, for instance, in their own houses or in their own shopping centers where they do their groceries. But in the second type of living lab, you need different places of encounter. You need to get people out of their daily lives. So you need to think of ways in which you can get people together and really think of how life could be different. And this also has complications in terms of time, in terms of resources, such as funding. So these are not things that are easy to do. But that's why we also pointed them out in our discussion, because that is, I think, the most important point in the end. This paper does not really aim that we have found the Holy Grail. We did not do this ourselves perfectly, but we just noticed some of these things along the way of our research. And we think that by thinking of living labs in this way, you can actually also help to, in our own future endeavors, it can also help us to find out ways to make it more inclusive. So to close off, we have some questions that came up in our own research and might be interesting for you, for the panel and also the other participants to think about. How can these two types of living labs be combined in a feasible way? I just discussed some of the difficulties, so maybe some of you already have some experiences with this sort of attempt to combine types of living labs resembling the way we conceptualize it. Another thing is, in general, what are your experiences with inclusive citizen engagement? Are there any best practices that you can share with us or with the group in general? And lastly, how can these inclusive citizen engagement in research be translated to policy? So when you have built this nice sequential design of these two types of living labs, and you have these results, how then can you get from the living labs towards changing policy? What are your experiences with that? We hope that this can be nice starting points for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Koen and Anke, for your clear presentation. So Koen, maybe you could stop screen sharing, and then the panelists could start their videos as well, so everyone can see each other. And I believe there are currently no questions. Yeah, so the panelists, please raise your hand if you have a question or if you want to comment. And everyone else, just to repeat, I think it was posted in the chat also, you can add your questions to the Q&A in Zoom, and we also invite all the panelists and Koen and Anke to respond to those questions as well, or to raise those in the speaking discussion. So I will just kick off with the first question. I was wondering, Anke or Koen, if you can say a bit more about how you arrived at those two types of living labs, and in particular, I noticed that while reading the article that the different cases that have been like the daily life version and the breakaway from daily life version, that there you refer to different authors and different research projects that have been going on, I think, separately. And that made me wonder if you had any discussions amongst the authors, and probably you had. And what were particular ideas or things that came up that really led you to considering those two particular versions of urban living labs?
Yes, it's a good question. I'll take this one, Anke, because I think, as for me, this was a very interesting process, in fact, because as we started, so there was sort of a division in our groups, and on one hand, Anke and also Sigrid, our supervisor, and they are consumption sociologists by training, and they increasingly used ethnographic research to actually look at how consumption practices work in practice. On the other hand, myself and Jan Ilko, we were involved in these consumption practice methods. They resembled more the first type of living labs, and we noticed that when people discuss living labs, these types of methods or ways of engaging with citizens were often not included when thinking about experimenting in urban environments. And Jan Ilko and I, we worked on these methods, like diffusion methods, which are often associated with urban living labs and experimenting innovation process. And this is something what we thought was odd, because we noticed also, Jan Ilko and I, that in our research practices also we had a hard time with really getting beyond the usual suspects as your participants. So we really saw the need to also have this inclusivity in check. And then when we brought these two insights together, we noticed that these are not, one or the other is not the way to look on urban living labs. They're both different ways in which you can view upon it. So in that sense, we did not have difficulties per se we were not saying like this is an urban living lab and no, that is not an urban living lab, but we really found out quite quickly that we had both perspectives were important to take into account. And so over time these developed into these two types of living labs. I don't know if Anke has anything to add to that.
Thanks. I see there's also a question from Leendert, and then so maybe Leendert, you can introduce yourself in one sentence and then ask your question, and then after that, just first answer the questions, Koen and Anke, and then we can go on to Mark and then Jess.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for your presentation and the paper. I work at AMS Institute in Amsterdam, where I develop, run, and learn in a lot of living labs, not only on food, but also on mobility, on data, on water, on energy. And I like the paper, and I like also the way you try to find your way in this messy world of living labs, and it does makes me think. So also on your own first question, and that is my question would be, why does it have to be two living labs? So it also seems to me it's two phases or two segmentations of one living lab. And what I like in trying to differentiate between it, and what I liked in your paper is that, of course, to include and secure participation of citizens, that's the holy grail to find that out and to make that work. But in our experience, you don't always need citizens to align with sustainability goals. You can align with also their own everyday goals where they are willing to change. So my question would be, isn't this just one, is it this one lab with two phases and two phases of finding out what everybody wants exactly in the lab?
Koen, if I can answer this one. Yeah, thanks, Leendert. I very much agree. I think that's a very fair way of putting it. So we distinguish it as two living labs, but in the conclusion, we try to bring it together, right, as a sequential design. So that's actually, I think, just a matter of how you formulate it, whether it's two kinds of living labs or two phases. I really like this idea of it being two phases, because I guess what we do want to do with the paper is show that both are essential. So trying to integrate them into one kind of big living lab, that will be the ideal goal, I think.
And maybe to add to that is that what we find out it takes so much time to set up and develop and operationalize a living lab, that once you have it, you should try to do more than one experiment in it, and not let go after one experiment. So that's why I like to see it as phases or experiments or types of interaction with the stakeholders and founding partners.
Yes, I agree. And just to add one thing, I think the reason also why we sort of conceptualize this as two separate entities is to also show in depth why both of these perspectives are important. Because I think in a lot of in the literature you see a lot of people hanging just to one of either of these categories, and then you miss out on a very important element of it. So I think the reason to not see it as, to not conceptualize it as two phases, but as two separate living labs, is because in some instances you also don't have the funding to do both, or you don't have the time or the energy, or maybe not the expertise to do both. And in that case, it's important to know that these two types of ways both have their own benefits and pitfalls.
Just one last remark, and there are other questions also, is that I think I would agree with that, but I don't agree that you always have to align citizens on sustainability parameters. It can also be on their own food preference parameters. So for instance, in Amsterdam Zuidoost, there are also many cultural diversity. And one project was to find out how all those foods that people like in their dishes can be produced locally. And the sustainability was a consequence of that, because it doesn't have to be flown in anymore from Brazil. So,
but I don't think we argue that. And actually, Anke can tell something about that.
No, I think that's a great example, Leendert. Actually, one of our colleagues, Jan Ilko, who's also an author in the paper, I think he was involved in that particular project. Good, that's excellent. No, that's indeed very much what we try to describe as this sort of unreflexive agency. So not targeting specifically on sustainability engagement, for instance, but really looking at food practices, what is happening in people's food practices beyond sort of calling it a certain way in recruiting people.
We have a lot, as you see, we have a lot more questions from other people. Can I give the floor to Mark?
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Balmford. Can you all hear me okay? I don't know if my microphone, okay, we're good. I direct the Sustainable Food Program at Yale University. I'm calling in from New Haven, Connecticut. My research is on controlled environment agriculture, especially the very well-capitalized forms of urban agriculture in the United States right now. And it's based out of the University of Oxford's School of Geography and Environment. I want to hear more about these green elites. The green elite term was used once in the introduction of the paper, and then we had the authors mention it. Who are the green elites, and where does their authority come from? How is it formed? What local was mentioned in the paper as a symbolic signifier of sustainability that a green elite might want to impose. But what are other titles, names, categories, associations that a green elite person or group might seek to impose, and how do they gain the authority to do that? How do you, in your context, become a green elite, and how do you gain the authority to say this behavior is sustainable and this behavior is not sustainable? In the United States case, we have like two amazingly sweeping kind of categorizations. One would be the obesity epidemic, where if you look at its development and sort of say, wow, this was like a PowerPoint presentation that showed a choropleth map of the United States in a time series. And basically from the colors on these slides on the map, it sort of constructed a crisis. Another might be the creation of a food desert, where this was not an observation on the ground of saying, oh, these people self-identify as living in a food desert. It was a cartographic exercise by an analyst who would say, here's where supermarkets are located and here's where poverty is located. Let's correlate those two things and give it a name, a food desert, and then it drives policy. So I know that those, obesity epidemic, even though it is mentioned minorly, and food desert don't necessarily have the same kind of symbolic currency in the sustainability aspirations of the green elite. Tell me more about what symbols and signifiers do have currency among the green elites, and how you gain the authority to wield them.
Yeah, so I think I'll take that question. So I guess the green elite, what we refer to is, what I understand by it, at least I guess in my research, is the one sort of very present in the debate, I guess the national debate on we need to move to more sustainable and healthy food, and it comes with certain kind of values, I guess you would say. So I think what I'm trying to say with green elite is people that are explicitly engaged with sustainability. So they're the ones living in the big city, driving the bikes to the farmers to buy very high, very expensive kind of cheese, drinking, eating vegan food, and all these kinds of things that are associated with a more sort of expensive and sort of explicit, I guess, ethical consumerism, right? So that will be my perception of what this green elite is. And then we contrast that with the people living their daily lives in the city of Almere that we researched, where the same kind of patterns may be happening, but not under the same number. So they could still be like, for instance, my research also involved looking at Syrian migrants from Syria in Almere, who also actually like ate a lot of seasonable food, went to the farmer to get their milk and stuff, but they're not really being seen as such as being sustainable because they don't explicitly engage with the values. So I guess the green elite part very much is to do with the values that are sort of carried.
I wonder, Mark, if you still want to quickly respond to that, or otherwise we can move on to Jess.
Maybe just ideas on where those values come from. Are they taught in universities? Are they taught in certain families with high socioeconomic status?
I think it also has to do with marketing. So I think in Almere we have these groups of people, and I think they're mostly from Amsterdam, but they come to Almere and they have all these organizations, Food Hub, Food Lab, and they have this sort of idea about connecting sustainability to what is nice and what is good and what is cool. So they have these new sort of products with certain sausages, which include also local, regional, organic ingredients. And this is really, it's also a big kind of marketing, and I think that also sort of dominates the debate much more than the small things people do in their daily practices to become more sustainable, even though they might not want to or not have the knowledge. But this is just one example, one dimension. I think there are many more dimensions to it, but this is something I observed.
Yeah, one more brief addition is also this example from our paper about the support your locals box, right? This box with local products that is then only consumed by a very specific kind of group.
Okay, Jess, over to you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and for sharing the paper, which I found really interesting. Because it gave a different perspective to what we do at RUAF. Just to introduce myself briefly, I'm an associate of the RUAF Global Partnership on Sustainable Urban Agriculture and Food Systems. And multi-stakeholder and living lab, urban food lab work is really at the heart of what we do. Our projects usually take multi-stakeholder platforms as a core pillar of assessing urban food systems and of planning. So what I liked about this paper was that the first part of the Urban Living Lab within the community was not only looking at assessing what is happening with the urban food system, but also looking at the adaptations, the non-reflexive adaptations people are actually making. So giving them much more agency rather than just looking at what is impacting them. My question, I think, or perhaps is more of a comment initially, is concerns the more reflexive, the more in-depth part of the Urban Living Labs. In reading the account, it's not really criticism because this wasn't your empirical work, but in reading the account, it all seemed really friendly. And what I felt I was really missing was different interpretations from the different stakeholders, different discourses, different priorities, and even potential conflict, and how that might have been handled, how power dynamics played out within that setting. When we think about inclusivity and work that RUEF does, we tend to think, first of all, about who is invited to take part and who is enabled in a very practical sense to get there through things like providing transport and payment, accommodation, childcare even, but also who is empowered to speak and put their views across, and who is actually making the decisions. And I felt in reading this that I was really missing who's making these decisions and who the winners and losers were of actually what the outcomes were, what the feedback loops were to the community, and what the actual community thought of these solutions, whether they had any say in the next stage, and whether there was any mechanism for capturing the impacts on different groups of people. So perhaps that's more of an empirical question, but I'd be interested to hear the author's comments on those perspectives.
Yes, thanks, Jess. And yes, you already say it. There are more empirical questions, and it's almost the questions you ask: who's invited, enabled, empowered, who makes the decision? These are really the million-dollar questions, right? I mean, if we had an answer to that, to how to make sure that people actually are all empowered, all invited, all enabled, all equally capable of making decisions, then we would have the solution to everything. Which I think in our paper we don't argue that we know that the thing that we did is these 4 questions, and maybe we did not address them specifically, but I think they are implicitly brought to the fore by making this distinction between first finding out who's in the lab. So in terms of who's invited, you only know who to invite when you know who's actually there, right? I mean, in this city of Almere, for instance, we have this very broad types of population in terms of ethnical groups, but also in terms of socioeconomic factors. So first you need to know who's in your lab before you can actually start thinking about how to invite people. In terms of empirical material, we use some examples, some empirical examples to illustrate these living labs, but they are not meant to show that is how this living lab should ideally be executed. So in for instance, our illustration of the second living lab, we discussed the Oosterwold case. And I think this is the perfect example of a case in which a limited amount of people were invited, a limited amount of people were enabled, empowered, and decisions actually were made in the end by the municipality. So they score bad on all accounts. And still, it is an example of how people can be engaged in depth, which actually eventually turns out to be realized in real life. So the thing we argue actually is if the second living lab if the first living lab should have been included in this process, it might have become a more inclusive result. And that's actually what we tried to show. Not that what we did was perfect, because it was very far from perfect. And actually we actually Jan Ilko and I, we actually did another project in Oosterwold recently in which we engaged citizens there. And now in advance, we actually made a survey to actually know, okay, who's already living there in Oosterwold, what type of people, how are they all progressing in terms of urban agriculture, so that we actually knew what questions to ask and how to enable people. And this time we also really gave the initiative to the citizens, like, okay, we are helping you to figure this out, but you are the agent in actually deciding what you will do next. And as it turned out, a lot of people actually did not want that also. They were also like, okay, we don't know how to start. Someone else, the municipality should step in. We're not going to do it. So this is an extra, I think, challenge to this. Is if you actually enable people, will they actually take up this role themselves? But this is a bit outside of the scope of this paper. But yeah, so the questions you asked are very important, I think, and we are continuously struggling with that.
Yeah, I want to go to the next question because of time, to Hannah.
Hi, I'm a PhD student who is studying participatory methods for food system transformation, looking at community researchers. I guess my questions relate a lot to what was just said and also to one in the chat. Like, firstly, in terms of definitions, like, how are you separating this from action research? Because a lot of what you say sounds a lot like action research. And the first part, it just sounds a lot like a lot of contemporary ethnographic practice. So I guess maybe you're just arguing that that needs to be incorporated in urban living labs. But yeah, I think in the way the whole paper was written, the way the language is used and the way you're discussing now, it feels like the way that urban living labs is being delivered here, it's about the researcher doing to the community and doing the research. And the community are like participating in the research that's being done by the researcher in the researcher's lab, which is maybe not your intention, but it comes back to the same thing about the power dynamics. And it is difficult because you can't like over romanticize people getting involved. They might not want to or have time to, they might want you to do it, like you're saying. You're later, maybe because it's just one case study, right? So you're saying you've done other things where you did it differently, but yeah, I guess it's just a question of like how, coming back to the power dynamics thing, but for me, addressing power dynamics is really about like who has access and believes that they can produce the knowledge. And this is how you end up with the green elites, because the people who are in charge of the knowledge which feeds into the system, which changes the system, are a specific set of people. And that's what I guess we're trying to break down. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any answers because there's lots of different participatory, collaborative democracy, participatory research stuff. This is like one collation, assemblage of stuff, right? But yeah, I'm just wondering if you could elaborate more on like how, yeah, like how did you try to empower people to actually take things forward so that they could be doing things for themselves, and which would feed into something being more sustainable? Because you talk about, in the paper, you talk about dropout. But if an urban living lab actually tries to go into people's lives and participate with them for a bit and help them to figure out how to change things in their own lives in a way that they can take on as their own decisions and something that they own, then that would be really changing the things. I'm not sure if I'm articulating this very well. But yeah, so firstly, questions about how are you separating yourself from action research, if you are? And the second question is, can you give more detail about power and like how you're considering that in design and breaking down the doing to people and the knowledge owner, creator role that researchers easily have?
Yeah, so first, your question is easy. Is this action research? Yes, I think especially the second living lab, the futuring is a type of action research. In most cases, it is used in an action research capacity. Is living labs thereby always, per definition, action research? I don't know. I think that is the thing that we are exploring a bit. That the first type of living lab, in fact, the way that we as a research team or some of us have done it is more of it's really like you said it. It's more of they are part of your lab. So you actually look at people, how they work, how they are experts of their own daily lives, but we observe them. So we don't actually help them to change their lives. But I think that's how we conducted the research. But I think that in general, if you construct this first urban living lab, then I do think that you can do it in such a way that you actually do enable people to change their lives. In that sense, that's I think to come to your second question. I think that you shouldn't consider the case studies that we use to illustrate these living labs as sort of the one way to go within the scope of this urban living. I think the things you addressed are very important. And I think that as we were doing this research, we came up with these issues ourselves, and then we wanted to write this paper to show, okay, if we want to increase inclusivity, and this also means the shift in power dynamics to actually enable people to change their own lives, then we should take these things into account. Then we should think of urban living labs in a certain way that actually helps us understand why that is important. So in that sense, I would stress not to take our empirical examples too seriously in terms of as the way to go, because they are not necessarily. I mean, they helped us, and they brought some things to the fore and other things don't, and we struggled with it, and afterwards we said, oh, we should have done, ideally this should work like this and that and that, but they are not meant to show off, so to say, like, oh, we did it like this, and oh, this is so great what we did, because I mean, this is just a work in progress for everyone. I think that's engaged in participative research. So that is, I think, important to bear in mind.
Sorry, I'm gonna use my moderator rights to ask another question that follows up on Hannah's question, I think, because I think there's also a question in relation to the first form of urban living labs, the daily life as a living lab. And yeah, are you, how is, what exactly is the living lab there, and who is this living lab for? Because in one sense you could see this as just the history of like qualitative methods that are used in sociological research. You just subject a diverse group of individuals to this type of research, and that then feeds into the urban living lab type 2 mode, I think. But you also talk about citizens or citizen consumers being experts of their own life. So can you say a bit more about how you see, what you see to be the living lab there, and who is this laboratory from, and basically, who are the lab technicians or the lab workers in this? Is that the researchers, or is that like those normal people?
I can say something about that, but I think Anke is more experienced in this.
Sorry, I was also trying to think about an answer to one of the questions in the chat. So the question is, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question is, on the one hand, you could see the research that you've been doing in the on daily life, and in the what you describe as living lab mode 1, say, as just qualitative sociology, and that I see that could feed into the urban living lab type 2, where you think about the future and so forth. But you actively describe this as a living lab, and I was thinking, who are the laborians or the lab technicians in this? Is that the citizens who are, you say, experts in their own lives, or is that the researchers? Who owns this laboratory?
That's a very hard question, I think, actually. I guess I would say when thinking about this paper, we really were thinking that the living lab is the daily life of citizens. So these are the
citizens, in fact, are the ones that I mean, you can, if you look at your life as one ongoing experiment, then your life itself is always a lab. And you're always experimenting and adapting with changing things. And oh my God, the store does not have any sunflower oil anymore. Oh, I have to get something else. What will I get? These are all very small, but indeed experiments and adaptations. And I think that what we try to say is that by studying that, you learn a lot about who's living in your lab. If we look in a bigger picture of a city, for instance, who's living there and what are they doing, and what should we include, what perspectives, what values. And in that sense, the lab technicians, who's a lab technician, who isn't, that's a bit of a semantic discussion. You can see the ones observing them and taking their ways into account. As lab technicians, you can see those people that actually do these experiments in their own lives. As lab technicians, I don't think that it's important to make this distinction, but I think it's important to see that indeed it is the methods you use are qualitative sociology, but by using these ways of thinking, these methods to actually help understand who's living in your lab before you do these type 2 large-scale in-depth experimentations, helps to strengthen and enable people more. That's at least what we argue. Whether that's true, that's something else, but that is the case that we make.
And also, I think that the roles change along the process, right? So in the first phase, you might be as a researcher, the lab technician, but maybe further on in a more participatory project, it might be more the citizens. So I think it's also very iterative in that sense.
Good, thank you. We're going to Claudia next, and I also want to say, I would also encourage more general reflections on the topic of inclusivity and people to draw more on their own experiences. At the same time is short, of course, so we'll just continue the list of hands. So over to you, Claudia.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. I'm a PhD candidate at Utrecht University, especially for ULabs, that is Utrecht University Living Labs for Sustainable Development. And my question was, I want to follow up a little bit on the question of Lendert, a lot of discussion came in between. But you say that the idea is you have these 2 types of living lab in a sequence. And I was wondering what happens when you finish the last stage. So why not to think this as a cyclical living labs? So you go from the first stage, then the second, and then when after you're futuring and you know what you want to achieve, then you create a new shared understanding and you involve more people to create that new future, and you start every time the cycle again. And you have a learning process in your society. So my question is about that. Do you think that could be a possible path, or what do you think?
Claudia, I think that is a wonderful idea. I'm almost sorry that I did not think of that when we wrote the paper, because that actually is, of course, how these types of things work. They're iterative and they're cyclical. They're not just ending at some point. And ideally, the second case that we studied, the Oosterwold case, actually, Jan Eelco is kept on working on this one and is still in the present day, and he each finds a new sort of specific question to ask in these labs. So definitely it's an iterative process. And I also don't think that our idea of a sequential design was necessarily, we never said and stop there. But yes, indeed, your suggestion to make it cyclical, to make it ongoing, is a very nice one. And I wish we would have followed that.
And also to add to that, I think, of course, we wrote it up quite neatly in the paper, but in reality, these 2 approaches, we were doing them at the same time in the same city. So that's also just, I think it was kind of happening in a way, but it could be more formalized, I guess.
Yeah, probably you'll always have financing for one project, and you always think from start to end, and that's one of the problems of Living Lab, that they always end. So we have to start thinking more cyclical than in stages. Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Ingrid, and then Nina. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm Ingrid Salev-Helin. I'm a professor of landscape planning at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, Department of Landscape Architecture, Planning and Management in Alnarp. And I'm also a landscape architect from the beginning. So my perspective is very much from landscape towards food, relations between people, food, and landscape from all aspects. So, and I'm also currently involved in developing a new master program at our university an international master called Food and Landscape, which is a very interdisciplinary program addressing a range of issues related to sustainability goals and putting place, landscape, and people and interaction in focus. So I found it really interesting, this conversation, this paper as well, and particularly the discussion here, not at least related to the green elite, for example, which we discuss a lot with the students in our program, because I think it's very important to understand what kind of mechanisms are driving issues on sustainability. We can also see a completely different direction in the world with development countries aiming for example, higher and higher meat consumption and wanting the same as we're having in this part of the world and so on. This kind of really to be aware of those conflicting drivers of food culture. And I also like that your paper is very much taking up all aspects of food, not only food ending by production of food, but all the aspects of food from production, consumption, buying food, cooking ingredients, and so maybe even sharing food as a meal, as a tool of interaction between people. Maybe that's a part of this as well. And I also really like this discussion about power relation, because I think it's really important. So when I'm listening and reading, I'm quite humble because we are developing this program and the knowledge as we are doing it, so to say. A lot of you have much more experience in research. I'm from different fields. And I'm reading it a little bit with my glasses, but I've been influenced by, for example, Caroline Steele, the architect, looking at how societies are built up and how we are planning and building our societies physically when it comes to the food lens, the food perspective. So I think what I'm trying to identify when I read and hear is parallel perspectives, so to say, using different words, as you are from several different disciplines, but I understand major sociology, several of you, and other disciplines. And let's say my perspective would be the physical landscape and the perceived landscape. So there I can see similarities there. I can see similarities when thinking about food as well as landscape, as a vehicle, as well as a target for sustainability, so to say. As food is something, daily food, the food is something we have to have every day. And it's something that engage, just as places is something that engages us, that includes us, what brings us common. And I think that those aspects are really interesting. But I would like to ask a question about the city of Almere as a relevant case study. And I understand it's quite special. I hope to go over this autumn with the Association of European Schools of Planning, have a conference, and we will go to Almere and also visit. So I understand Almere is the place to go when it comes to understanding and looking at how sustainable food planning. So if I was to take a study like yours, studies, building up a living lab, not in Malmö, because Malmö is where I'm nearby, is also very good at this. What you say it's a relevant case study, but it's been working on those issues for many, many years, from developing from a garden city, I understand, to all this kind of different research and interaction with the municipality and so on. Is it possible at all? How can you think of that? Could we develop this kind of studies and research anywhere? And what kind of challenges would it be?
Yes, it's a good question, and I think it's, of course, it depends a bit on very practically the funding that's available. I mean, if you are somewhere in a city and there is a research group that has funding to do these types of living labs, and they have connections with the government to work together and yeah, you already answered your own question in a way, because if you don't have all these things, it's really hard to make such an urban living lab work. And I think even in Almere, this is not always easy. I mean, we are also always struggling to get the funding and get the projects and get the people to participate. So I think it's never ever easy to do this. And in some places it works better than others, definitely. In that sense, Almere, yeah, is a relevant case study. It's mostly just our field of work where we worked. So this is just an illustration of how these things can work in a city such as Almere that also has a particular scope on food. But I agree, if you would do it in another city which has less interest in having a food agenda and has less of an infrastructure to make this work, yeah, then it obviously will be more difficult.
We have only about 10 minutes left for this formal part of the event, and then we can continue informally. But
Okay.
and I see that Nina has to leave, but I don't know if you still want to ask your question now.
Yeah, I can do that quickly.
Yeah,
First of
okay.
all,
Thank you.
thanks a lot for this paper, but also for this wonderful discussion. I think that really makes it super rich and the kickoff of your paper to think in different directions here. My name is Nina Vogel, and I'm the Vice Program Director at SRU Urban Futures, and that is a strategic research platform at the Swedish University of Agricultural Science, and we are tasked with supporting transdisciplinary research, education and collaboration. And I think from there comes also a reflection which links to different aspects which were mentioned, namely also that understanding and Living Lab as an arena for learning processes, and also what you kind of in between the lines, sometimes more explicit or not so explicit, mentioned in the paper, like who is learning and what are the actor constellations here. And I think we touched upon demarcation of the lab, or let's say phases maybe. I think it was a bit confusing, and thanks to the different inputs you got already, I think that clarified or was a good feedback to you. In particular, the first phase or lab, I think like who is learning there and in which way, and that maybe offers some really interesting aspects to your case in Almere, and offers you also the feedback loops. I think Claudia was into it, and the cyclical processes, and also the time aspect you kind of mentioned, but we didn't go so much into detail here in this discussion. That like how you stretch that in length, but also maybe in feedback loops, and I think that could offer really interesting aspects. You even ask yourself about the policy feedback and the roles. So sorry, I make a like a collection of aspects which I pack under the aspect of learning, because I think really interesting with these new roles, and not only on the focusing on citizens, but also for researchers, but maybe also for other like policymakers. So more feedback. I guess we have no time. I think it would be great to hear the audience also who is not visible here. So, and I unfortunately have to leave and pick up my daughter, but wonderful, and I hope to keep in touch. Thank you.
I guess Anke and Koen, if you want to respond, then Nina can still see the response in the video recording afterwards. Yeah, and then after that, I think I want to give space for Jess for another question. And then final reflections from your side, Anke and Koen. And I wonder also if you have any questions to the other people in this room, and we could spend a few minutes on that too. But first on Nina's question.
Yes, I think the learning process definitely is important, and this is something we did not personally address or study, because this is not really our area of expertise, the how people learn and how you engage people in a learning process. But I think it's very important, and I think it's important to include in such a study. And I think it's important in both cases and both types of living labs. But yeah, this is not something that we address because it's not really our expertise personally. But I hope this type of paper, and if people think, okay, this is something that we are into, the learning process, yeah, that I hope this paper also incited this discussion, and people that are into this learning process can address this in some other way.
Jess, or I don't know, Anke, if you still want to respond first. Otherwise, Jess, yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to ask a second question at risk of dominating. But I wanted to bounce off Hannah's comment about the role of the researcher and just ask how to be really sure as a researcher or any other convener of a lab that you're being really objective and self-interrogating your own prejudices and actually identifying who is in your lab in the first place, who is not actually visible to you because of who you are and what your framings are. We do a lot of work in lower income countries, and if, for example, if you were to have a convener of a lab who is from local government, they are often completely blinkered to the informal sector, for example. And there's some Bill Vorley of IAED's done a lot of work on the food system of the majority, which is really difficult for people who aren't within that context to understand really all of the dynamics. So I think my worry is sort of taking this into a completely different socioeconomic context, whether it's still really going to be relevant. And then also within the labs, sort of as the lab technician or the person facilitating the lab, making sure that our own researchers' own prejudices aren't affecting the power dynamics. And there are some really good challenging literature from the US on food policy councils. I'd be happy to share references, dig them out and share them, but really just how to really examine our own framings and positionings in being the conveners of these labs.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question that we also don't really have the answer to, but I would definitely want to actually hear more from the other panelists and participants maybe. But one thing I probably will say is that I know another research project where we look at trying to build a food community. It's still in the Netherlands and in the city of Almere, with a very sort of culturally diverse kind of group. And we really do this again in different stages. So we first really look at the sort of food identities of the people that are present in the city of Almere, around dairy in this case. And then we also really look at how do they get together around food. So they, for instance, have more informal cooking sessions that they have together, or they share their recipes through Facebook or something like this. So really thinking about within each specific community, what are their habits around food, and then indeed also this informal sector. I think it's really nice that you mentioned that often gets overlooked. But once again, to make the point that it's really important to know who's living in the lab and to really take seriously the communities you're working with. And it's very much a learning process here, I would say as well. So for me, starting in the city of Almere, I didn't know a lot about the communities, but in the end, I did. And that's the nice thing about staying in one city for a long time. And I realized that we're quite lucky to have that position. Yeah. But maybe other people from the audience have more suggestions.
If you have any suggestions, we have still like 1 or 2 minutes to talk about that. Yes, Hannah?
I kind of put a comment in the chat. I don't know, like all the reading that I've done and personal experience that I've had, it feels like the challenge of like, how do you manage true participation is kind of, and now that we are attempting more like collaborative governance of many things, that's something that needs answering, but I guess it's like thinking about what Jess was saying. How do you take this into another context? I mean, it's just about there's a lot of different participatory technologies, you know, like open space, or there's so many different participatory mechanisms. I guess it's about taking it to the people and finding out what's going to work for them, with them, and also paying them ideally to participate with you, and kind of breaking down to that power in that way as well, which is challenging in terms of resourcing, I suppose. But yeah, I don't know.
Okay, final reflections from Leendert, and then I'm afraid we're gonna have to wrap up. But as I said earlier, the space will be open for another 15 minutes to continue conversation. Leendert.
Yeah, I'm not giving a final reflection. Sorry, Walter, I leave that to Koen or Anke. I just want to say that I think the challenge of a lab is to make it work in your own context. So there are so many different situations, so many different definitions, and so many ways to draw the boundary. So I think the discussion we have, Hannah says, where's the boundary? Who's inside and who's outside the lab? And who's running the show? So, is it the citizens themselves? Is it citizens plus the citizens, the researchers plus the citizens plus the city, or is it also companies? So who is actually there experimenting together, and whose goals are trying to be reached? So I guess depending on that, the answers are in the paper, or the approach of the paper is fully doing that, but there's some, let's say, implicit choices in what is the lab, in what I would say in the paper. And if it works, it works. So there's so many views on citizen inclusion, and so that's my observation. I see so many different forms of labs only in Amsterdam, which I'm trying to uniform, but it's just impossible to make them uniform in my experience.
Okay, so good. Any final words from Koen or Anke?
You mean about this or in general?
In general.
In general. Well, no, I just want to thank everyone for reading our paper and thinking with us in this session. I really, the thing I think that stuck with me is this this idea that Nina mentioned. I think that learning. I think that's a really nice one. So we could also probably call it an urban learning lab in a way. For us as researchers.
Koen, anything?
Yeah, just that I think that most of the questions that were directed at us now, like how to deal with the power balance, how to include, how to enable people, I think these are all questions that everyone is struggling with individually, well, aiming or trying to do this type of research. I hope that through these types of this, I mean, there's so much buzzwords going on in action research and participative research, and I think Urban Living Labs is one of them. But by trying to define a bit what works for you, and having a response from researchers, I think is very valuable, and I hope that we can continue to do that, and maybe other people can take up this debate and bring it further based on their own experiences and reflections. It would be nice.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anke and Koen, for all your answers and responses, but also all the participants for your for reading the article, for coming with well prepared with lots of ideas and lots of comments on the article. It's really what makes this event, I think, interesting to people to join. Yes, I hope on that last point, Koen, that also Table might be continue to be one of the spaces where we can have those discussions with researchers, with other stakeholder groups to see how we can make transformations more and the discussions more inclusive. I also feel that we're sort of only scratching the surface of this topic, as is always the case with these types of events, I'm afraid. But we will continue the discussion after this formal part and then switch off the recording. And I want to say that anyone who wants to, also of the attendees, anyone who feels they want to share that, want also to join the discussion and to talk, please raise your hands and then we can promote you to panelist, and then you can join this discussion too. Good. I also want to say a lot of thanks to the Food and Cities Network, who initially came up with the idea of having this event, and to Andrew, who has been doing a lot of work on the background and it's now taking care of the technology with Zoom as well. Yeah, I quickly wanted to say something from Table, that is that I think that topic of inclusivity is very strongly linked to our current theme about power in the food system. And you can follow our work on that on our website. And I believe one of my colleagues will put a few links through which you can stay up to date about our work, including about power and also, I guess, about inclusivity. Yeah, that you can follow that. So yeah, we'll just have a short, like 1 minute break to give people the chance to leave if they want to leave, and then we'll continue the discussion in a more informal way for those who want to stay. And as I said earlier, if you want to join that as a panelist, then please raise your hands and we will promote you so you're also able to speak and start your video. Everyone, thank you so much for your interest and for your input today. We're also running a discussion thread on our community platform that is going to be linked to this event. And I hope that might be a space where we can continue the discussion. And also, I saw that there are quite a few questions in the Q&A. Maybe some of those we could move to community platform and see if some of the authors, panelists would be able to give some response to that as well. So yeah, thank you very much for your interest and for your time and for your engagement. And we hope to see you at a future table event.